Hey there! This is a video where some guy who spent way too much time in Lightroom is trying to tell you how to spend a lot less time in Lightroom. But in reality, the only way to get faster at working with a program like Lightroom is to spend more time and actually get used to it. But still, I want to talk you through my top tips, tricks, and ways I speed up my workflow so I can get more things done in less time. And just before I start, this is not a video about the ways I edit stuff. If you wanna see that, I have an entire playlist up there about my Lightroom editing workflow, which admittedly is a bit different from what other people do because I've developed Lightroom tools and I use them to speed up my workflow. But today I don't want to talk about that. Today I want to talk about ways to use a mouse and a keyboard to get more efficient with your edits. So let's jump into Lightroom and we're gonna start before even entering the editing mode. Over here on the right side of the import dialog, you can select any preset that you have made or downloaded off the web. And in here, for my editing style, I like to apply a preset that just reduces the contrast and changes the default camera profile. Because Adobe Color, which is the default camera profile, for me is way too contrasty. And I like to change it to Adobe Standard and even in some cases to camera flat to do my basic adjustments, and then I'll come in and apply a color response curve camera profile that I developed. But that's just my style. The general takeaway here is that you can apply some base layer of settings on import so you won't have to do the same exact adjustments later on when you start editing. To create such a preset, we're gonna take a photo that we haven't tinkered with, click reset, just for good measure, and then we're gonna change the camera profile. I'm going for Adobe Neutral, and I'm also going to decrease the contrast over here to roughly -45. That's a personal preference, and you can do whatever you wish. Now I'm gonna click here on this plus, I'm gonna click Create Preset, uncheck everything, check just the contrast and the treatment and profile because that's what I want in my import preset, give it a name, save it, and then you can apply it on import on all the photos moving on. But keep in mind, this method is a double-edged sword at the beginning. On the back of your camera, you're probably gonna see a much saturated and contrasty color, and then when you import the files, you might be a bit disappointed with how they look. So an alternative is just to keep this preset on hand and apply it manually when you start editing your photos after you selected what you want to edit. Tip number 2 has to do with organization. I like to reorder the panels in my develop modules. The cool thing about Lightroom is that you can customize your develop module. And that means you can just hide panels or you can reorder them however you want. I don't even remember the default order, but I remember that lens correction was not at the top, and I remember that calibration was somewhere low on the list, maybe even the last one. And that meant I had to do a lot of scrolling going up and down through the list to find what I was looking for. So when creating my custom order that you can see on the screen right now, and maybe even give it a try to create a natural progressing, starting with the stuff that I do in the beginning of the edit, and lower on the list, you'll find stuff that I rarely touch or that I do just before I finish my edit. And since we're talking about organizing stuff, I like to keep my presets organized as well, and I think that will speed up my workflow if I precisely know where to look for them instead of scrolling to a big list of presets. The only problem is that Lightroom does not allow you to drag and drop to reorder stuff around here. So what I do instead is add axes if I want something to be at the bottom of the folder, spaces in front of the name if I want something to be at top of the folder, and also have a few zeros in front of the names of my folders, and that way they will sort from the one with the most zeros through a normal alphanumerical title, because everything here is sorted alphabetically. So whenever you want to organize stuff in your presets, just right click one of them, click rename, and if you want them to be in front, just add a zero or a space in front of them. And now that I organize my workspace, there's another thing that I want on screen. I'm pressing E on my keyboard right now, and Lightroom will display some information about the photo. I like this layout over here, where I can see the camera that I was using, the lens that I was using, some exposure parameters, and most importantly, the file format of this photo. This is important because if you do a lot of editing and maybe have multiples of the same file, you'll find yourself wondering, is this an edited file that I sent to Photoshop and back again? Or is this the actual raw file that I can just reset and start the edit from scratch? Now, all I have to do is just glance at that information up there, and I know exactly what file am I working on. And of course, you can customize what information Lightroom is showing you by going to View, View Options, and now you can select from a huge list what information you want Lightroom to display on screen. And while having the text on screen all the time might be annoying or distracting while you edit, if you press E on your keyboard, it will cycle through the information, and E on your keyboard once again is gonna make it disappear. And I kinda started thinking about key bindings before mentioning that you kinda need a good keyboard and mouse for Lightroom as well. I know everything would do, but if you have a numpad on your keyboard, it would be much easier to input numerical values in the develop modules to do fine adjustments, and for the mouse I actually have some specific things in mind. This is my MX Master 3 from Logitech, and I wouldn't recommend this mouse to anyone even though it's a productivity mouse. Yeah, having 2 extra buttons on the side is great. Having another wheel on the side is amazing. This mouse is not amazing because it literally melts in my hand with this rubbery back right here that I will not zoom on because it's disgusting. But on the other hand, having more buttons on your mouse is kinda necessary, and having a side scroll wheel is really nice because I can key bind it to Ctrl plus and Ctrl minus. And that's a nice way to do zoom in Lightroom at different zoom levels. Contrary to the usual zoom levels in Lightroom, where you can select something from this drop down menu, it zooms in the photo, and now you can toggle with space going back and forth, but that's about it compared to the nice zoom that I have on the side of my mouse, and this is not gonna work by default. I have my secondary scroll wheel binding in such a way that it goes for Ctrl plus and Ctrl minus, and those are hotkeys to zoom in and out in Lightroom. And speaking of keys, the Alt key is really important in Lightroom, and it does so many things that I'll probably miss a few. First of all, if you hold down Alt key in Lightroom, you'll see that a lot of this section's title changed to Reset. And if we click on that Reset title, it's gonna reset just the section of the edit that is between those two lines. And this is a very quick way to reset just a portion of your edit and readjust from there. And speaking of resetting, remember when we used to be able to toggle on and off entire sections of the develop module? Well, hold down Alt and the eye symbol over here turns into a toggle, and you can just turn the entire panel off until you need it again when you would press Alt again on the keyboard and enable it for good. The eye symbol is just temporary. If I click it, it turns it off, but it's going back on the second I release my click. And this actually allows me to turn off multiple sections at the same time. Let's say now I have color mixer, calibration, and the color grading off. And that's something you cannot do with the normal toggle with the eye symbol because you can only click one eye at a time. Another awesome thing that the Alt button does in Lightroom is here in the masking panel. Let's go to mask number 6, zoom in, and you can see that if I press the Alt button, the Add and the Subtract buttons change to intersect. Intersecting mask is inside Lightroom is really powerful, and if you want me to do a video on that as well, let me know in the comments down below. But if you know what that does, you will also know that this is a super powerful tool. But let's keep rolling with the use cases for the Alt button because it does a few more cool tricks. If you're holding down the Alt button while you're dragging on some of Lightroom sliders, you're gonna see a completely different image. For example, if I hold down the Alt button and I start to drag on the exposure sliders, I can easily tell where my exposure is starting to clip in the whites. And the same thing will happen with lots of sliders. For example, with the blacks, you can see where you're clipping your blacks when dragging on the black slider. And an even cooler trick is in the HSL panel where if I hold down the Alt button, I'm gonna see just the color that I'm affecting without being distracted by the other colors. You can see now that I'm dragging on the blue channel, and if I press Alt, all the other colors are gonna get desaturated. And it will work exactly the same with the saturation section and the luminance section. And I can even release it while dragging on the slider to see the colors and press it again to get the black and white version. If I'm scrolling down some more to the sharpness tab, I can alt click on the amount to see a black and white version so I understand the sharpness a lot better, and especially with the masking slider, if I alt click and drag on it, I'm gonna see exactly what edges in the image get sharpened. And this is really cool for images like this one, where you don't want sharpness to be applied to the noise in the sky. So I would drag it to something like this, and this means the gradient in the sky is a lot smoother. Again, for luminance stuff and denoising, it's gonna show you the black and white version. This is cool, but not that useful. And one of the best thing that modifies when you alt click a slider is in here in the post crop vignetting zone. Let's say you added some post crop vignette and it's a rather small amount. So when you are dragging on the midpoint or roundness or feather sliders, you're not gonna see much of a difference. But if you wanna get a better understanding of what's going on, you can just alt click while dragging on the slider and the amount will jump up considerably. And now I can see exactly what's happening to my image and where vignetting is being applied. And when I release the click, it goes back to the amount that I actually selected and the image goes back to normal. And there's one last thing that changes while holding down the Alt key modifier. If you're in the crop or the masking panel, if you are holding down the Alt key on, let's say, a linear gradient, and you're trying to move it around by the edge, holding down Alt will pin the middle of the gradient and you'll move just the lateral parts. The same things happen in the crop. If I'm holding down Alt, both sides will move equally and the center will remain still. And a similar thing will happen if you are dragging on a linear gradient. But if you Alt click on a brush mask, you're gonna turn your brush to erasing so you can toggle between adding and subtracting mask on the fly. The bottom line is that the Alt key is super useful inside of Lightroom. And the same thing happens with the Shift key. But before I go there, double clicking any slider inside Lightroom will reset the slider to the default position. And also, did you know that you can click and drag on any numerical value inside the develop module and that will adjust the slider with a bit more precision than dragging on the slider itself? And not only that, if you want to adjust the basic adjustments, you can come in here and play around with the basic tone settings, but you can also drag on the exposure, highlight, shadow, whites, and black sliders by moving around on the histogram. You can see here how each section of the histogram is highlighting when I'm hovering over it. Well, if I click and drag on this one, for example, it's gonna change the exposure. And you can see what each section means if you hover over it, because down at the bottom, it actually says that now I'm affecting the shadows, and for example, now I'm affecting the highlights. Another super useful button that not a lot of people use in Lightroom is the O button, and I use it so much that it is actually binded to the side of my mouse. I've done this because I don't want to be reaching over to my keyboard and back to my mouse again over and over again. In Lightroom, O stands for overlay, and you can see an overlay of where your mask is affecting the image on any kind of mask if you press O, and you can toggle this with the tap of a button. Also, when you are cropping an image, O will change the grid that you have overlaid on top of your photo. Again, super useful, and you can cycle through around 10 or even more options. But having a nice and colorful overlay when you're masking stuff, especially if you're combining multiple masks, is the more important one. The crop thing is just a small bonus. And speaking of bonuses, here's a tip if you feel that you overcooked your image. Let's say that I feel that this is way too much, but I like the direction of the edit in general. I can come in here and create a preset. Let's call it overcooked. I'm gonna save it in my tools because that's the first category over here, and I'm gonna click check all. Now I can come in here, apply the overcooked preset, and just slide the amount down by a bit, and this will tone down the entire edit. This is a nice way to tone down an image where you like what you've done, but you feel that it's a bit too much and you are not happy with the final results. Just keep in mind that with stuff like my Lightroom borders, you're gonna have to reapply them because it also means that the border mask is gonna be toned down and it will become transparent. So I'm gonna click that once again and my borders should be back to normal. And finally, allow me to talk about the Shift key. This is another one of these modifiers that does a ton of things inside of Lightroom and is super useful. And we're gonna start by dragging on any slider, but holding down the Shift key. This slows down my sliding considerably, while making my mouse disappear, of course, but now I can adjust any slider way more precisely than I would be able to without holding down the shift key. So maybe think of it as a halfway pressed brake, like it's slowing down considerably anything and you have a lot more control. But it also has an effect on a curves panel. If you hold down the shift key, you can move a point just vertically without being able to drag it to the left or to the right. And in here, the alt key is actually the slow down modifier. So Shift for blocking the point on the vertical axis, Alt for dragging it slowly, and you can also combine them to drag it only on the vertical axis, but slowly. Also, in the basics panels over here, if you double click any slider while holding down the Shift key, it's gonna set that slider to the amount that it would have been if you actually clicked the auto button on the entire image. But it's affecting just the slider that you double clicked while holding down the shift key. And also the shift key is extremely useful when it comes to masking. So let's go in, create a linear gradient, and I'm gonna hold down shift, and this forces my gradient to be perfectly horizontal in the image, or if I start my gradient from above the image and hold down shift, it's gonna lock it to the vertical axis. The same way, if I hold down shift while creating a radial gradient, it's gonna lock it as a perfect circle. And if I create a brush mask and I click somewhere in the photo, hold down shift and click in another spot, it's gonna trace a perfectly straight line from one point to the next one. And another super useful trick that I've seen recently is that if you come in here and create a brush mask, make it really small, click outside the image, and then increase the size of your brush and shift click it somewhere in the image, you can create something that resembles a cone of light, and you can subtract the subject from it and give the impression that you had another light just outside the frame blasting in the smoke. And I'm sure you are going to use this technique to create cones of light in a lot of other situations. But yeah, this was me rambling for around 20 minutes about Lightroom stuff. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe you actually learned something from it. If you did, you can also check out my website where I sell Lightroom tools, Lightroom presets, grain, color response curves, a lot of crazy stuff that is a bit different from a normal one-click preset that gives you a locked-in look, because I usually prefer to create stuff that just enhances the way you edit and not lock you in a certain way that I like to edit. But anyway, thank you for watching my video and I'll see you in the next one.